This is the 12th in a series of programs I'm doing on wisdom and what famous thinkers in philosophy, psychology, literature, and religion have said about it. My last program dealt with the question, what might be a wise person's attitude towards conformity and being popular? Today's program will deal primarily with the question, what might be a wise person's attitude towards other people? But first, a brief review of the last program. On the subject of conformity, I pointed out that sociologists claim that there are inner-directed people and outer-directed people, and that people who tend to conform a lot can be categorized as outer-directed people. And specifically, what does that mean? Well, when outer-directed people ask themselves the question, how shall I live? The answer usually is based on the idea that they will live like many other people live, that they will take their cues about living a good life from other people, from the advertising industry, from the television industry, movie industry, music they hear, and maybe celebrities as well. There is a consensus among the famous thinkers that wise people generally tend to be inner-directed people. Again, they generally don't take their cue from other people as to how they're going to live their other lives, how they're going to live their lives. Also, I think it's fair to say that wise people, being inner-directed people, are not much liked by the advertising industry because they're difficult to manipulate. Why are wise people, generally speaking, inner-directed people? Well, I think Goethe provides some illumination. The famous German thinker put it this way. He said, "It is unthinkable that wisdom should ever be popular." The idea is that thinking, like playing baseball well or playing the violin well, is a skill. And just as few people have the ability or the skill to play baseball well or to play the violin well, so too, very few people, it is said, have the ability to think clearly and to think well. Also, the idea is, at least the idea that famous thinkers have expressed, is that when one follows the crowd, one is usually not acting wisely. Montaigne, the famous French intellectual, said this: "The wise man should retire to within himself, to remain free, and retain the power to judge things freely." Would a wise person be a popular person? Well, as I indicated last week, Confucius, the great Chinese philosopher, provides some illumination here. A disciple once said to Confucius, "There is a man in a village nearby whom everybody likes. What do you think of that?" And Confucius responded by saying, "That's not sufficient." The disciple then said, "Well, there is a man in the same village whom everybody dislikes. What do you think about that?" And Confucius again said, "That's not sufficient." The disciple was somewhat perplexed, and then Confucius responded. He said this: "It would be better if good people liked the man and bad people disliked him." Socrates, several centuries later, echoed Confucius when he said this: "We must not consider at all what the many will say of us, but only the experts in justice and injustice." I'll say that again. Socrates said, "We must not consider at all what the many will say of us, but only the expert in justice and injustice." Psychologist Dr. Joyce Brothers has reported on studies done of popular people in psychology. And she says those studies reveal the following information concerning popular people. She says the person who is very popular and whom everyone likes usually has an ill-defined personality with few views or opinions of his own. With few views or opinions of his own. An important question, I think, is this: can one be a very popular person and be very open and honest in expressing one's opinions? Let's take two very famous baseball players as examples. Baseball superstars Derek Jeter and Alex Rodriguez. primarily the New York Yankee stars. I shouldn't say primarily, they are the stars of the New York Yankee team. We know that they are both very popular people, and perhaps deservedly so. But I wonder if Alex Rodriguez and Derek Jeter went on nationwide television and expressed strong opinions about abortion, gay marriage, affirmative action, the war in Iraq, President Bush, former President Clinton, Rush Limbaugh, if, for example, one of them were to say that he very much likes Rush Limbaugh or very much dislikes Rush Limbaugh, or if one of those two players, or if both, were to announce that they are liberals or conservatives, would they be as popular after the nationwide television interview as before? I suspect that as people learned about their real feelings, their opinions on these very controversial subjects, they would be less popular. By the way, that's not intended as a disparaging comment about either baseball player. Rather, I think it's a comment on the idea that it's difficult to be both popular and very forthright in expressing one's opinion. There is a consensus among the famous thinkers that it's rare that a person be both popular and wise. Again, it's rare that a person be both popular and wise. Shakespeare, in commenting on the rareness of wisdom in this world, has King Lear, in a very despairing declaration, say this: "When we are born, we cry that we are come to this great stage of fools." Again, there is a consensus among the great thinkers that it's not unusual that foolish people in this world are honored, whereas very often wise people, virtuous people, are not infrequently disliked. Indeed, the Buddha in the Dhammapada says this about wise people, and this may surprise you. The Buddha says this: "The world may hate the wise person, but good people love him." Jesus said something similar. And now to the question, what might be the wise person's attitude towards other people? Well, so many of the great religions and so many of the great philosophers, particularly Schopenhauer and Bertrand Russell, claim that wise people look upon other people as their fellow sufferers. I know that sounds rather pessimistic, so allow me to explain. The idea is that wise people have a good understanding of life and what people experience in this life. And they know that people on a daily basis experience stress, anxiety, nervousness, perhaps loneliness, frustration, job-related problems, relationship-related problems, death of a loved one, injustice, feelings of inferiority, inadequacy, etc. So again, there is a consensus among the famous thinkers that one of the proper attitudes towards other people is one of compassion, realizing that everyone in this world suffers. Thoreau said this about life. Henry David Thoreau said that life is a warfare, a struggle. And indeed, the Stoic philosophers of antiquity said that in confronting life, we should think of ourselves as warriors. Longfellow put it this way: "If we could read the secret history of our enemies, we would find in each person's life sorrow and suffering enough to disarm all hostility." In Buddhism, the foundation of that religion is the first noble truth, which is life is suffering. And the Buddhists go on to say that since life is suffering, therefore the proper response to other people is one of compassion. And so much of the Buddhist religion is based on the idea that we should have compassion for our fellow human beings. The major religions and many famous philosophers have stated that wisdom is never divorced from compassion. Wisdom is never divorced from compassion. Indeed, Jesus in Matthew 5 put it this way: "Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy." And Schopenhauer, the famous German philosopher whom I often allude to, in one of his books claimed that as people grow older, one of two characteristics will come to dominate their disposition, either envy or compassion. And he says that if envy comes to dominate a person's disposition, that's usually the result of the person's ignorance about other people, that the person is ignorant about how much suffering everybody does in this world. Whereas, if one becomes a very compassionate person, that's based on insight rather than ignorance. The idea being that a person realizes what other people endure in this life. Indeed, I think if one just looks around one's own neighborhood, one will again be reminded that there are people experiencing illness, serious illness, whether it be cancer or heart disease. In every neighborhood, there are probably people who are either separated or divorced. There are people whose children, some of whose children are not doing as well in school as they would wish. There are many people experiencing job-related problems, money-related problems, etc. And again, the wise person is well aware of this when he looks around his or her neighborhood. The Tao Te Ching, famous Chinese book of wisdom, which I often allude to, says that we suffer from envy. The Tao Te Ching says that compassion is good for us. And here is a particular sentence from the Tao Te Ching which I think summarizes this thought very well. Heaven arms with compassion those whom she would not see destroyed. The Bhagavad Gita, famous Hindu holy book, talks about freedom from envy. And the Buddhists claim that compassion can be an antidote to anger. How can compassion be an antidote to anger? Well, one of the examples they give is this. If someone has mistreated oneself and is angry at the injustice that has been perpetrated against oneself, and that's natural to be angry if someone has treated you unfairly, the Buddhists claim we should think about the law of karma. In Buddhism, that's the law of consequences. It's the idea that when one treats someone unjustly, oneself will suffer, whereas when someone treats someone else well, one will be rewarded for that. So the Buddhists claim that we should have compassion even for those who treat us unfairly, because after all, they will suffer for the injustices they have perpetrated. Jesus, of course, also sounded a similar note. Jesus, in so many passages in the New Testament, emphasizes forgiveness. And the very famous Stoic philosopher, Marcus Aurelius, echoes the Buddhists. Marcus Aurelius claims that if somebody has treated you unfairly, you might confront that person and point out to them that in their efforts to hurt you, they have hurt themselves. There is a consensus among the famous thinkers that the proper attitude towards other people encompasses two ideas: compassion and the golden rule. Houston Smith, famous professor of religion, who is really this nation's expert on religion, in his famous textbook on comparative religion, a book entitled The Illustrated World's Religions, says this. He says all the major religions teach some form of the golden rule. And what is the golden rule? Well, I think most of the viewers are familiar with it. Jesus in Luke 6 expressed the golden rule. He said this: do to others as you would have them do to you. And Hillel, the very famous Jewish sage, put it this way. Well, first of all, I should point out that one day this very famous rabbi was confronted by a heathen, and this heathen said to Hillel, you can convert me to your religion, but you're going to have to express to me the entire Torah while I stand on one leg. The Torah, by the way, are the first 5 books of the Hebrew scriptures, which encompass so much of Jewish law. And Hillel said this to this heathen, again, who insisted that Hillel expressed to him in a very brief way the essence of the Torah. Hillel said this: what is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. That is the entire Torah. The rest is commentary. Confucius may have been the first to express the golden rule. 500 years before Jesus was born, Confucius said this: "Do not impose on others what you yourself do not desire." Confucius placed great emphasis on how we interact with others. Confucius believed that when we show goodwill towards others, that tends to elicit reciprocation in others. Do you think, by the way, that there is a relationship between compassion and morality? Does morality begin with fellow feeling? Confucius believed that wisdom is based on treating others justly, but it's also based on a deep, fundamental understanding of human nature. Confucius believed it would be difficult to cultivate wisdom if one did not cultivate a profound understanding of other people, of human nature. Which leads to the question, what have the famous thinkers said about human nature? Well, I'll be doing a series of programs in the near future about the answer to that question. But right now I'll provide a brief overview. Freud, on the subject of human nature, said this. He said human beings are complicated, they are aggressive, they are ambivalent in that they often love and hate the same person, they are often unconscious of their motivations, they are deniers and repressors. They often deny the truth about themselves to themselves. Freud went on to say that we are all sinners and we all have a dark side. I find it interesting that Professor Harold Bloom, who is perhaps America's expert on the great books, has said that he hears the voice of God in Freud. Indeed, he mentions 3 writers in whom he hears the voice of God. Professor Bloom says he hears that voice in Freud, Emerson, and Montaigne. Some people might find it strange that one would hear the voice of God in Freud, since Freud was an avowed atheist. So what is Professor Bloom alluding to? Well, I think he's alluding to the idea that both Jesus and Freud urge us to war against whatever is sick in us, whatever is bad in us. I'm confident that Freud would agree with the writer Willie Morris, who summarized the gentle person in this way. Willie Morris said this: "The gentle person is he or she who has warred the most against his own inner violence." And I think Jesus and Freud would probably agree with that assessment. Freud went on to say, as so many famous thinkers have said, that human beings are often irrational. Socrates put it this way: "There is much imbalance in all men." And the novelist Henry Fielding said this: "No man is wise at all hours." Ralph Waldo Emerson commented that no man is permanently wise. And I mentioned before that Shakespeare's King Lear put it this way: "When we are born, we cry that we have come to this great stage of fools." It's also been said that human beings are very complicated. I mentioned before that Freud believed that. Another famous thinker who emphasized this idea was the very devout Christian Blaise Pascal. Pascal was both a Christian and a famous mathematician. And in expressing his idea about how complicated people are, he said this, and I'm quoting Pascal: "There are 2 natures in man, the one good, the other bad." The psychiatrist Carl Jung said something very similar, and here are Jung's own words: "The self is a union of opposites. The individual is confronted with the abysmal contradictions of human nature. For in the self, good and evil are indeed closer than identical twins." Psychiatrist Alfred Adler, in talking about human nature, emphasized the idea that most human beings, maybe all human beings, have some feelings of inferiority and inadequacy, and as a consequence of these feelings of inferiority and inadequacy, they often strive for power and superiority over other people. Here are Adler's own words. It is the feeling of inferiority, inadequacy, which determines the goal of an individual's existence. He went on to say, the goal of superiority, of power, of the conquest of others, is the goal which directs the activity of most human beings. Let me say that again. The goal of superiority, of power, of the conquest of others, is the goal which directs the activity of most human beings. Isn't it true that throughout much of history, men have sought to exercise power over women? In many areas of the world, white people have sought to exercise power over black people. In Africa, some black tribes have strove to exercise power over other black tribes. And in Europe, among other places, some white ethnic groups have tried to dominate other white ethnic groups. Tolstoy on this subject said this. Again, Leo Tolstoy, the famous Russian novelist. What men considered sacred and important were their devices for wielding power over their fellow human beings. Schopenhauer has talked about another aspect of human nature, and that is, as he saw it, people's propensity for mask-wearing and role-playing. Schopenhauer put it this way: we all wear a mask and play a role. Psychiatrist M. Scott Peck echoes Schopenhauer when he says this: most people opt for lives of very limited honesty and openness and relative closeness, hiding themselves from the world. Again, most people opt for lives whereby they hide themselves from the world. And the great novelist Charles Dickens, in A Tale of Two Cities, penned the following words: every human being is constituted to be that profound secret and mystery to every other human being. A brief summary now of what so many of the great thinkers have said about human nature. Again, they claim that people are complicated. They claim that people are not infrequently irrational, that it's not unusual that people have feelings of inferiority and inadequacy, that many people seek power over other people, that mask wearing and role-playing are not unusual, and that envy is not unusual. The very famous Dutch philosopher said that people are naturally envious creatures. What do you think? You recall that Pascal said that we have two natures, one bad, which accounts for man's inhumanity to man, but the other is good. Interesting that we do have a good nature, and therefore we are capable of compassion, we are capable of love and of service to our fellow human beings. We are, of course, products of our genes and our environment. Maybe Jesus was thinking about the latter when he said in Luke 6, do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. The idea is that the person who has wisdom, when interacting with other people, has this understanding of himself and others, a rather deep understanding of himself and others. Whereas the unwise person, the very ignorant person, when interacting with other people, is rather ignorant about himself and human nature, and therefore his interactions with other people will reflect this and will probably be less fulfilling. The idea is, just as if we know a lot about operating a computer, operating that computer will be a lot more fulfilling if we are very ignorant about how to use a computer. Because if we are very ignorant about how to use a computer, it's going to cause us a lot of frustration. Well, I think the same thing holds true in our interactions with other people. if we are very ignorant about them and about our own nature, it's going to make our interactions much more difficult. I mentioned earlier that so many of the famous thinkers have said that since life is difficult, since everyone suffers, therefore we should approach others with both understanding and compassion. The writer Erich Hofer, who was referred to as the longshoreman philosopher because he did work on the docks of San Francisco many years, has expressed the most profound words I've ever read on the subject of compassion. He claimed that compassion is the antitoxin of the soul. Let me give you his entire passage. Compassion alone stands apart from the continuous traffic between good and evil going on within us. Compassion is the antitoxin of the soul. Where there is compassion, even the most poisonous impulses in us remain relatively harmless. The Dalai Lama has put it this way. He says, if we interact with others with a compassionate attitude, our interactions will be far more fulfilling if we don't interact with others with a compassionate attitude. Finally, Henry David Thoreau reminds us that we are all artists. In his masterpiece, Walden, Thoreau penned the following words: to affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts.